What if I told you that Ferrari's last great improvement by 2025 has not only solved anything, but has worsened his technical situation? What if I told you that the SF-25 hides an internal design war that is making it an unpredictable monster? I'm going to show you what nobody has told you about this car, and why the Ferrari season is fracturing from the inside. Instead of integrating on a basis that led them to fight the title of builders in 2024, Ferrari decided to erase practically all the known of the SF-24 and start from scratch. This was not an improvised decision. It was the result of an internal obsession to change the course of the team and mark a before and after in the Vasseur era. But this decision was a double-edged sword, because in his attempt to find a new design language, Ferrari was exposed to fundamental errors. Changing almost everything from a car also means giving up certainties that had earned for years. It is like changing the language without dominating it yet. And that was reflected from the first laps of the SF-25 on track. The most striking and perhaps the most controversial modification was the passage of an pushrod front suspension to a pull rod. A change that not only alters the dynamic behavior of the car, but redefines all the surrounding aerodynamic flow. This configuration, more difficult to put ready, promised to clean the flow under the chassis and open greater development possibilities. But it also imposes millimeter demands on the general balance of the car, especially if it is not accompanied with adequate rear rigidity. And here is the real problem. Ferrari decided to maintain a pull rod system also in the rear suspension. An unprecedented decision among leading teams. McLaren and Red Bull, which have been technical references in this type of configuration, use pull rod on the front axle, but maintain push rod in the rear to guarantee stability and adjustment capacity. Ferrari, on the other hand, went further. And that technical boldness has had serious consequences. The lack of stiffness and precise reaction in the rear train has left the SF-25 with erratic, unstable, difficult to predict in high-speed curves and even more complex adjusting for different types of circuits. The car needs to operate in an extremely narrow range of parameters. Any mismatches, even minor, compromises the aerodynamic integrity of the whole. And there is even more. Ferrari also decided to extend the wheelbase and move the cockpit backwards, a change that in theory should improve the mass balance and allow a better peso distribution. But when combined with the radicality of the side pods, which now have a very aggressive lower cut, what they obtained was an ultra-sensitive car at driving height and longitudinal balance sheet changes. In a nutshell, the SF-25 is wonderful in the wind tunnel and a nightmare on the track. What seems like a masterpiece on paper, in reality it has been a still unfinished experiment. A car that needs very specific conditions to shine. And that, in Formula One, is a judgment of instability. The question is no longer whether Ferrari was too aggressive, but if he really understood the complete consequences of his own technical daring. When a Formula One car is designed with a radical philosophy, one of the biggest risks is that this concept only works under an extremely specific range of conditions. And that is exactly what happened to Ferrari's SF-25. What in the theory seemed a visionary design, in practice it has exposed one of the most dangerous technical traps that an elite team can suffer. The creation of a car with an operational window so narrow that makes it unusable outside of those ideal parameters. The SF-25 depends, almost like a religion, on operating at a minimum conduction height. That was the base of design, to make the most of the soil effect to generate aerodynamic load without penalizing resistance. But this is where the combination of factors begins to sabotage the project from the inside. Because for the soil effect to work, the car needs to be as stuck as possible to the ground, with a stable and rigid platform that allows to maintain that constant height in lines, curves and braking. And that is where the pull rod rear suspension system becomes its worst enemy. Pull rod on the rear axle does not provide the structural rigidity necessary to sustain the car platform in its ideal range. Unable to maintain that height consistently, the SF-25 becomes vulnerable to the phenomenon of vertical oscillations, better known as porpoising or rebounds. Not only that, but also suffers from asymmetric compressions that directly affect the longitudinal balance and traction in curve outputs. Given this situation, Ferrari has been forced to raise the height of the car beyond what the original design contemplated. This has a devastating effect. When the car goes up, the aerodynamic seal of the flat background is lost. The pressure generated under the ground decreases, and the aerodynamic load disappears as if a switch turns off. The most serious thing is that, to avoid sanctions for excessive wear of the plank, the flat background, they have had to directly give up dozens of load points by return. The car simply cannot run as designed, and that is a competitive conviction. The most illustrative case occurred in the China Grand Prix. Although the controversy focused on the disqualification of Lewis Hamilton, the reality is that this event highlighted a much deeper situation. Ferrari was operating on the same edge of the regulation. If the car went down a millimeter, they ran the risk of being sanctioned. If they raised it, it became uncontrollable and inefficient. And that is where the true trap is revealed. There is no simple solution for this technical dilemma. Any adjustment that compensates for a part of the problem generates a new complication in another car area. In addition, the SF-25 has shown to have chaotic behavior under variable track conditions. A more rough asphalt, a curve with potholes, or even a temperature change can alter the balance of the car disproportionately. Fred Vasseur explained it clearly in an interview. Small changes in balance or track conditions cause dramatic performance between classification and career. It is not an exaggeration. It is a technical fact. The car is so sensitive that even pilots have to deeply alter their driving style to be able to extract some consistency. Lewis Hamilton, for example, has had to modify its curve input, releasing accelerator before the usual to stabilize the rear. Charles Leclerc, on the other hand, has been frustrated by the lack of predictability in each stint. The car is unpredictable, and that, in modern Formula One, is synonymous with defeat. In the middle of the season, when the problems of SF-25 were already impossible to ignore, Ferrari launched an update that promised to mark a before and after in its performance. The headlines talked about a discrete but key evolution, and the team took care of not generating exaggerated expectations. But the truth is that this update was much more revealing than it seemed. Not for what he solved, but for what he exposed. The improvement focused on three areas: the flat background, the rear suspension arms, and small modifications in the profiles of the pontoons. At first glance, marginal changes looked like, but the intention was much more ambitious. Ferrari wanted to correct the problem of structural instability that prevented the car from maintaining its aerodynamic platform in optimal conditions. And for this, they needed to reinforce the behavior of the rear axle, which remained the great Achilles heel of the SF-25. In the flat background, the lateral suction channels were redesigned to improve the car's ability to seal the air under pressure, especially in deep braking phases or when traveling through aggressive pianos. This modification should allow the car to operate at a slightly higher height without losing all aerodynamic load. It was, in essence, an attempt to minimally expand the very operational window of the SF-25. But here the toughest paradox of the project was revealed. For these improvements to work, the car should continue to operate within margins almost impossible to maintain during a complete race. What was achieved was an improvement in stability in medium and fast curves, but only when the conditions were ideal. When the crosswind, the temperature changes of the asphalt, or the wear of the tires altered the dynamics of the car, the problems reappeared as if nothing had changed. In addition, the rear suspension arms were reviewed to offer a more progressive response to the compressions, seeking to eliminate load peaks that destabilized the car in traction. Was it worked? Partially. Charles Leclerc reported a greater coherence at the back of the car during the Austrian GP. Lewis Hamilton, meanwhile, acknowledged that the car was more predictable in classification. But in career rhythm, the benefits were limited. The SF-25 is still too demanding with the rear tires and does not allow the stints to be extended without losing competitiveness in an abrupt way. This improvement also exposed another conflict: the fight between simulations in the wind tunnel and reality on the track. In Maranello, they were convinced that the aerodynamic concept was viable, but the correlation between simulated data and real behavior remained inconstant. Something did not close, and that forced the team to perform additional tests in free sessions, subtracting preparation for classification and career. The media impact was silent, but internally it was a hard blow. Because while McLaren and Red Bull refined details in their packages, Ferrari continued to try that his basic car behaved with logic. We do not talk about tenths of improvement. We talk about trying to make the car consistent return after return, not to become an unpredictable machine with each rubber change, fuel load, or track degradation. And this is the most worrying: the car does not yet respond consistently to improvements. The original SF-25 concept is so delicate, so sensitive to any external parameter, that even functional patches are limited by the conceptual rigidity of the base design. There is no room for error. And that level of structural demand becomes unsustainable in a season where each team evolves every 2 or 3 races. So Ferrari's famous invisible update was less a solution and more a confession. A tacit recognition that the SF-25 concept is not broken in one part, but in its complete structure. And that leaves us with a question that Ferrari still cannot answer: How long can you invest in a car whose essence does not accept change? And that's why I leave you with an open reflection. Are we witnessing a repetition of the same historical cycle of Ferrari, in which everything is committed to an ambitious but poorly implemented idea? Or this is the turning point in which the team will recognize that it needs a more solid base, even if that means redefining its car from the root? Leave me your opinion in the comments. Do you think SF-25 can still be saved? Or should Ferrari start to work in a new concept by 2026?